who is a 2020 graduate in mind-body medicine. And her, by the way, Katie, you can, at this point, go ahead and get your PowerPoint up while I go through the introduction. The title of her program, well, she's titled it a little differently here, so I'll let her introduce the title. I'll just go ahead and talk about her background. Katie Cooley is a yoga teacher, a somatic guide, founder of the Joy Yoga Project in Spokane, Washington. For her, embodiment is a gateway to presence and purpose. As a yoga teacher and somatic guide, she's devoted to restoring trust in the body. Her work helps others to reconnect to their mobility, their stability, their strength, not through force, but through intentional movement, clear narrative, and inner alignment. She's a nationally board-certified health coach and adjunct teaching faculty in Saybrook University's Integrative Wellness Coaching Program. She studied Hanna Somatics and Somatic Yoga with one of our pioneers and Saybrook founder, Eleanor Criswell, from 2009 to 2014, and Eleanor encouraged her to pursue graduate studies at Saybrook. Katie also serves as a board member and supports curriculum development for Akhila Health, a nonprofit that empowers underserved women. She founded and ran the Spokane Yoga Initiative from 2002 to 2015. She is a certified Katona yoga teacher and runs the Joy Yoga Project, as I mentioned earlier. She's excited to share her findings from her dissertation research that explored the experience of eating disorder recovery through the lens of embodiment practices. She followed the experiential methodology of Saybrook University's Sandy Sela-Smith and the pioneer in existential phenomenological psychology, Clark Moustakas. She used a heuristic self-search inquiry. Findings included a shift from being externally to internally referenced, the experience of joy, and the self-emergence framework. She has a new book in process, which combines literature from her dissertation and guidance for students of yoga. The book is entitled The Song in Our Bones, a manual for understanding and changing mind-body patterns. It is in its final stages of editing, and she hopes to have it out for the public by Christmas. And now I welcome Katie Cooley to introduce her title and her presentation. Go ahead.
Okay. Woo. Thank you, Dr. Moss. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you everyone for being here. I followed this hashtag, like hashtag PhD life, and there was this meme, it's like the swear jar where you put a coin in, a quarter in every time you swear. Well, this was every time you talk about your dissertation, you have to put a quarter in the jar, for your family doesn't want to hear about it. So I really appreciate being able to talk about this with you guys. So thank you. And the only thing about that bio is that I just graduated in 2025, so not in 2020. So I am only about a few weeks from being finished with what it was like.
Whoa. A fresh congratulations then.
And so besides all of those things that were said about me in that introduction, I also have a personal long-term experience with an eating disorder and with eating disorder recovery and the different phases and stages of that as I've grown and aged myself. It started when I was a really young child. And as I was getting ready for my dissertation research and I was thinking about eating disorders, I kept coming back to just sort of how bodily they are, or how bodily it was for me or is for me to have gone through an eating disorder experience. So much about it was a feeling, more so than what I was finding in the literature and the research, which was kind of posing it as more of a thought process or a mental health issue For me, it felt so bodily. And so as I was thinking about like sort of the sensations and the posture and the tension, like the tension of being in a body, um, um, I wasn't resonating with the dominant frameworks in the literature of, like, for example, negative body image, that was really prominent or is really prominent. And though it has, that framework has certainly helped many, for me, it never really resonated because it really missed what it actually feels like, what it actually felt like to me. So I wanted to zoom out from the body image construct, and I wanted to start kind of asking or finding out who was talking about eating disorders as something other than primarily a distortion of image, but more as a disruption of embodiment. And I also was wondering what are people saying recovery looks like when it's approached through that lens. Um, and then, so I was looking for another way of approaching eating disorders, which meant almost even calling them something else, which was really hard to do. I had to keep using it. It's in my title, as eating disorders is still in the title. But I read a book by Susan Bordeaux called Unbearable Weight. It's from the 90s, and she's a philosopher who, among other things, has written a lot extensively about eating disorders. And she used the phrase othering the body, which really names the way a person relates to their own body, almost as if it were separate from themselves, an object to be managed, controlled, judged, rather than a living part of the self. The term othering the body gave me a way to describe a bigger range of attitudes and behaviors that showed up in eating disorders, and how the self can perceive, regard, or respond to the body as something other than the self. And it offered me a bridge to shift the conversation from body image toward embodiment. So once I started thinking about the experience of othering the body, I dove into the embodiment literature that explored ways that our mind-body relationship can be disrupted or dysfunctional, or experienced in a way that shows something wrong with it, something wrong with ourself. So this dysfunctional, disrupted mind-body relationship. And I realized I needed a methodology that would capture the kinesthetic and affective lived experience of othering the body, and where that would evolve to. Because this inquiry was going to be about embodiment, about how we perceive, how we make meaning of our proprioceptive and interoceptive, so internal milieu selves. I needed a method that could generate descriptions from really inside, so from inside my interiority. I needed to understand my own sort of internal infrastructure, where psyche and soma, or, and depending on who you ask what the definitions of these words, but sort of like my psychology along where that overlapped with my physiology and physical experience of the self, where my lived experience of being in a body, and the way I think about that could be brought to light. So as mentioned, I dove into Sandy Sela-Smith's work with Heuristic Self-Search Inquiry, because this methodology brings forth the evidence, like it brings forth descriptive evidence of one's personal experience in a topic using deeply self-reflective and creative activities to access intuition, and this sort of infrastructure, this sediment, this corporal infrastructure or tacit dimension, that is a combination of sensation and posture and emotions and experiences from the past, physiology. It's like all of it, all kind of in a big bundle. And it's really pre-reflective. So I had to find a way to be able to access information that was probably a little bit outside of my normal way of talking about things. And for those of you who don't know, heuristic inquiry is a qualitative research methodology, and it was Clark Moustakas, as was mentioned, was the person who brought that forth, and he was a former Saybrook as well. And but it's not about testing a hypothesis or validating a theory, but really sort of an expedition into uncharted territory. And where a paradigm has not been clearly defined, as what I was looking at, which is embodiment, eating disorders through the lens of embodiment, a heuristic inquiry or heuristic self-search inquiry can be a way to gain some traction and to move that research further. So my two research questions emerged over some time, going through the initial heuristic inquiry processes. And the first question is really about helping me explore the ways that my body had been perceived, like how I had perceived myself as separate from myself. So I had to ask this question from the context of somebody with a history of an eating disorder. What is that like? What is the experience of othering the self or of just being in a body? The second is helped me to look at the qualitative first-person experience of embodiment itself. So the kinesthetic and the affective, the sensory experience of actually inhabiting my body. Together, these questions invited me to study and a shift, really, what I called othering the body. So from othering the body to what I called inhabiting the self. And so in heuristic inquiry, data collection really means gathering data that is hidden within the researcher who describes the problem. So for me, the primary mode of data collection was self-dialogue journaling. Which was, I primarily used dialectic self-interview, which is where the researcher is like, it's like role playing with the self. So I'm the asker researcher, and then I'm the answerer researcher. And you would go through questions and ask them to yourself over and over again. So for example, I might ask myself, why do I want to do a heuristic inquiry on embodiment and eating disorders? And unless I just wanted to write down the same thing each time I asked the questions, I had to allow words to come from somewhere else. So I had to just wait for different words to emerge, and they did. And each time I asked these questions, I would go to another place. I would get a deeper and deeper answer. Ultimately, I filled 10 notebooks of more than 800 pages of Cornell style notes over 18 months. And I considered much more than just the dialectical interview. There was other types of just journaling, dreams, reflexive journal entries, encounters with others, reflections on the emerging content, and deliberate reflexivity about the process were all contributing to new insights. Okay. So my findings kind of synthesized into two overarching themes. The first was that my eating disorder was a response to, as you can see here, censoring emotions rather than thinking there was having a negative body image, like really thinking about what my body was like. It was about emotions. I had developed a lifelong habit of censoring emotions and experiences, and this kind of censorship reinforced a disconnection between my body and my sense of self. And then the second finding was that my recovery required addressing my mind-body connection directly, not only through insight or mindset change, but through bodily processes, explicit kinds of bodily processes. So for me, that meant specific yoga practices that helped me experience my body in the present in an embodied way. specific practices that gave me access to different kinds of sensations, different sensing of breath, so different ways of breathing, and different ways of feeling posture in that I had previously, and I'm going to say forgotten. But from a somatic sense, it's more like it's more like a somatic forgetting, or a somatic remembering, like coming back to a sense of sensations that I had not experienced in some time. So through the phases of the research and the heuristic inquiry phases, I began to also be able to notice the physiological changes that occurred during those postural changes, as well as when I was learning how to feel my own emotions, which I'll get to in a second. Um, and so really it was like a therapeutic process in and of itself, which is very aligned with heuristic self-search inquiry, as I went through the data collection and analysis process. So there was sub-themes beneath those two themes. There was two sub-themes beneath finding number one and two under finding number two. So the first two were emotional becoming and somatic becoming. Um, so, so emotional becoming, this was really interesting because this is really what this showed up a lot in the data, which was this inability for the linking of sensation to meaning. So it's like sensation had been decathected from emotional valor or emotional weight. And in recognizing emotions as which then led to, once I could start to link emotions to sensations, recognizing that emotions were really a bridge between my experience of my body and my experience of my mind. I realized that my eating disorder was so much more related to like the emotional suppression that was a habit that began at some point in my life, which ended up being very consistent with the literature that shows low interoception and difficulties with emotional regulation in people with eating disorders. But there was another level too of this as well, because in heuristic self-search inquiry, Sandy Sela-Smith calls it surrendering to emotions. So your emotional experience as the researcher is part of how you are collecting your own data. So what she calls it is kind of reclaiming your emotional experience and developing your I who feels voice, or speaking directly from within your lived experience. So in doing that, I was able to move from suppressing emotions to expressing emotions, from this uncertainty, which came up a lot, uncertainty of not knowing, to having an inner compass, and then from being externally referenced to being self-referenced. And so part of all of that was this linking sensation to emotion or meaning. But the second part of that was connecting the connecting meaning back to sensation and developing the capacity to act from that meaning. So at first, I realized I could feel sensations in my body, but I couldn't name the emotions linked to them. Then which I found in the literature was related to the physiological sort of consequence of self-othering, which showed up as stress responses and bodily tension. So there was this very bodily or somatic consequence to the emotional suppression that became a pattern in my soma, or in my physiological processing of events in the present. Instead of feeling secure in myself, I felt a sense of fear. Instead of stability, I felt dislocation, and a disconnection between my inner experience and my outer perception, sort of not having a sense of my outside perspective and perceptions aligning with my internal experience. And especially in moments of challenge. to go through this evolution, I used a somatic body scan, and Sandy Seela's has a couple of different exercises that she created in her work to start to go in and notice sensations, and allow words like "this feels like sadness" to come up, which was very unfamiliar to me and uncomfortable to me to say this sensation has an emotion attached to it. And then to be able to have the dialogue with those words. So to having a dialogue with what is this sensation telling me I need? So that's showing here with low interoception, linking meaning to sensation, ignoring sensations to I notice my feelings when I am in a situation and I dialogue with them, which then sort of evolved into nervous system dysregulation to nervous system regulation. Okay, the finding number 2, which was my recovery from an eating disorder, was addressed by improving my mind-body connection. So that had two sub-themes, which were bodily undoing and self-emergence. So I had to kind of change my graphic here because I wanted it to be more circular, because both of these feel very cyclical and spherical in the way that I understood them. So in the center of the circle was two ideas that came from my literature review. One was being a spectator in my body, and the concept of unhomelikeness, where not feeling at home in one's self, in one's body. That was then sort of the next level of that was the posture of suppression of emotion, which I've already talked about in the somatic becoming, which included muscular tension and ignoring sensations in the body, which then lead to pain, somatic pain, physiological and emotional, and then somatic pain and stress patterns. So for me, it showed up as injury and pain, so that I was working through a hip injury that happened during the middle of the research process. It was literally like my body was falling apart. And when that happened, I had to start looking at the bigger picture, really zoom out of the bigger picture pattern and looking at ingrained patterns so that I could then start to understand the whole big picture of what was happening in my body, what was happening in my physiology, what was happening in my mental and emotional experience. So then from the bodily undoing, some from the breakdown, really from the injury and the working through the injury, another set of part of this sub-theme emerged, which was beginning to inhabit the self rather than being a spectator in my body, and then the feeling of being at home or at homeness. So this is really the culmination of all three of the other sub-themes, and the undoing of the ingrained bodily patterns. So self-emergence was the experience of beginning to feel integrated again, to feel at home in my body, and through this embodied kind of shifting or cyclical process. A central part of this was developing a sense of safety. So over time, some of those movement practices that I was describing earlier that were kind of making me remember a sense of stability, a sense of groundedness, a sense of having a center, those were really specific movement practices, specific sensations, specific both kinesthetic or proprioceptive experiences, and mostly having to do with the position of the pelvis and the relationship between my pelvis and my spine and my feet. So, and this was consistent with a lot in my literature review with researchers like Tom Hanna or in Feldenkrais research, where we were looking at the relationship between the spine and the pelvis really shaping physiological and physical well-being. So for me, emergence meant that these structural shifts in posture were matched by shifts in my inner life. And as my body became more organized and supported, my sense of self did too. I was no longer feeling externally referenced. And I was no longer sort of performing for others or in service of other people's or other systems' goals. Instead, I went to feeling more dynamic stability, mobility, and a sense of safety in my body. I had the sense of a greater range of experience, positive embodiment. My embodiment began to feel positive and functional, and then even experiences of joy began to emerge. So I'm just going to finish with some of the implications there that I took away from this. Is to, I guess I think one of the main pieces of it was broadening the eating disorder dialogue and in prevention and treatment to look beyond the traditional body image framework to include embodiment and experience and the broader or more zoomed out experience of self-othering or body or othering the body. My findings highlighted that also bridging cognitive therapies with somatic practices, so including specific movement, somatic or yoga practices, and recognizing how posture and chronic tension and can kind of go hand in hand with unresolved emotional patterns. For practitioners, this means like therapists, coaches, and yoga and somatic educators could integrate these embodiment frameworks into their work. And even some of the aspects of the heuristic self-search inquiry, because of the way that it brings the tacit dimension in. So it kind of brings us this overlap, of the body and the mind. It really gets, it really explicitly works with that overlap, which is really what embodiment is. And then in training or research, this study affirmed how having an N of one can allow the research to go into novel places, deeper places that might not happen in larger, more less personal environments. So it talks about the idea of somatic literacy being a part of psychology and counseling education, and then in both of those, helping future practitioners engage as fully as possible in the therapeutic process. And then finally, I think for individuals, these findings may resonate most with those who don't see themselves reflected in the appearance-focused models. So I also looked at highly sensitive people, or I also talked about athletes because of my athletic background, who've learned to override their bodily signals in performance-driven environments. So for them and for many others, embodied approaches may or can provide a pathway to self-recovery and self-connection and authentic recovery.